John Osborne. John Osborne was a prominent English playwright and actor in the modernist period. His work often depicted the struggles and discontent of the working class, challenging the established social and political order. Osborne's raw and emotionally charged writing style, combined with his willingness to confront controversial issues, made him a transformative force in British literature, and specifically British theatre. His other notable works would include The Entertainer and Luther, 1957 and 1961 respectively. Through his influential plays, Osborne reshaped modern drama and left a lasting impact on the literary landscape. But what made him so influential? For this, we'll have to understand what exactly was going on in England in the 1950s. Britain's post-war economic policy was based on the Keynesian model of redistribution and welfare state economy. The welfare state economy was adopted by the Labour Party, and it is the process in which the Labour Party adapted itself to the new circumstances after the Second World War, while transforming the British society by following a mixture of Keynesian model of redistribution and socialist principles of state sponsorship. The special relationship with the United States and the support for NATO are the basic principles in the foreign policy of that period. The loss of the empire leads to the politicians to follow the policy of Commonwealth in order to preserve its powerful position in the world politics. The loss of the empire as an important actor in the world paves the way for integration of Britain into European community, and the special relationship with the United States becomes the basic principle in the foreign affairs. The governmental devices try to adapt themselves to the new developments in politics and economics, but reconstruction of the political devices in accordance with the new needs of the state necessarily takes time. In this context, the British society is faced with conflicts and social upheavals of the transformation period, as it is successfully portrayed by Osborne in his play Look Back in Anger. Look Back in Anger is a kitchen sink drama, or a working class drama. A kitchen sink drama is the name given to plays that depict the daily struggles of ordinary working class people. Plays in this category often deal with social issues such as poor living conditions, lack of employment, poverty, and turbulent relationships. The kitchen sink dramatists sought to convey the language of everyday speech and to shock with its bluntness. When John Lennon sang Working Class Hero is something to be, he might have meant at least something. Thus it becomes understandable that the original angry young man, that is Jimmy Porter from John Osborne's Look Back in Anger, and Joe Lambton from John Brayne's Room at the Top, they fall back on this mythologically charged mode of a subcultural subject formation. That is to say that this is a subcultural male subject form that gains further influence through protagonists like Alan Silito's Arthur Seaton from Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. As a consequence, the working class hero slowly steps out of the depths of his former realms into the light of social attention, becoming a male role model to believe in, and thus becoming something to really be. In a modern or postmodern world of shifting identities, the working class hero provides a very simple but effectively reaffirming mode of male identity formation. A mode of subject formation that even gains global influence, such as James Bond. So by this time it's clear that the 20th century British drama rose in reaction to chaos that had engulfed the post-war England in all respects. Political, social, psychological, economical, and Osborne's plays refer to the disorder that came up as a natural consequence of the traumatic experience of the Second World War and of a decade-and-a-half-long political and economical management in England in the name of Reconstruction. The sufferings of English people reached the zenith during this decade, with no employment, increasing taxes, inflation, exchange crisis, public interest, constantly sacrificed to pander the ego of politicians. This caused dissatisfaction in the intelligentsia, and especially the sensitive and serious-thinking youth, who were most vehement in their protest against such messy situation. Like all sensitive young men of this time, Osborne too registers his protest. Osborne attacked on the establishment and expressed an ostensible cynicism about issues that dominated the contemporary political landscape: the Russian quelling of the Hungarian rebellion, the Egyptian takeover of the Suez Canal from Anglo-French imperialists, and the question of nuclear disarmament. While such political preoccupations have led critics to brand Osborne as the angry young man, what remains neglected is a return to the cultural archive of race relations in the 1950s, within a post-imperialist Britain. Such a return is necessary, as it reveals a great deal more about Osborne's complicity in the act of consolidating the practice of empire by naturalizing the social relations in the play in ways that construct the other as subordinate. We will see this when we see the dominant dimension of the pro-imperialist political intellectual culture of the 1950s, a time marked by a shrinking number of jobs, increasing immigration from the ex-colonies, and an increasing awareness of race relations in a post-colonial Britain that had to redefine itself as a declining world power. So therefore, Osborne's pro-imperial attitude is not produced in a vacuum, but derives from a particular historical moment in Britain. When Britain was facing occasional labor shortages in the post-war economy, the less attractive jobs were taken up by immigrants. Because a number of industrial cities were in Midlands, immigration pressure seemed to be greater there, since it was easier for the immigrants to find jobs. Because of the immigration pressure, the 1950s also witnessed race riots in the Midlands and in London, and racial hostilities increased. The year 1956 was also the peak year for the arrival in the industrial cities of immigrants from the West Indies, Pakistan, and India. At a time when overseas students and immigrants created a threat to jobs in Britain and even undercut wages, the colonial world seems a much brighter place. The decline of empire would see the disappearance of the idea of Englishness, because of the fact that it does not gather people around a certain concept or an idea which is a necessary principle to be a society or union. Needless to say, each society has a myth in order to gather around it. So post-war era is the period in which all the social and governmental agents are trying to construct an identity, a myth for British people, because the loss of empire and the desire for adaptation to the new situation had destroyed the old myth. The myth of the idea of Englishness, the idea of English superiority, and the sun that would never set on the British Empire, as the older traditional ruling class of the English, which was in decline, could not understand why the sun wasn't shining anymore. Amidst all this chaos arose the angry young men. Osborne emerged as a central figure in the angry young man movement, which expressed the disillusionment and frustration of post-war British youth. But what exactly is the angry young man movement of the 1950s that we keep talking about? Angry young men were basically various British novelists and playwrights who emerged in the 1950s and expressed scorn and disaffection with the established socio-political order of the country. Their impatience and resentment were especially aroused by what they perceived as the hypocrisy and mediocrity of the upper and middle classes. The angry young men were a new breed of intellectuals, who were mostly a working class or of lower middle class origin. Some had been educated at the post-war red brick universities at the state's expense, though a few were from Oxford. They shared an outspoken irreverence for the British class system, its traditional networks of pedigreed families, and the elitist Oxford and Cambridge universities. They showed an equally uninhibited disdain for the drabness of the post-war welfare state, and their writings frequently expressed raw anger and frustration as the post-war reforms failed to meet exalted aspirations for genuine change. The trend was evident in John Wayne's novel Hurry On Down and in Lucky Jim by Kingsley Amis, and it was crystallized in 1956 in the play Look Back in Anger, which became the representative work of the movement. John Osborne was described as an angry young man by the Royal Court Theatre's press. This name of the angry young man was extended to all his contemporaries, who expressed rage at the persistence of class distinctions, pride in their lower class mannerisms, and dislike for anything highbrow or phony. So the angry young men then were acknowledged as the dominant literary force of the decade of the 1950s. Their novels would feature a typical lower middle class or working class male protagonist who views society with scorn and sardonic humor. He may have conflicts with authority, but he's nevertheless preoccupied with the quest for upward mobility. Like that of the Beat movement in the United States, the impetus of the angry young man was exhausted in early 1960s. Now, let's move on to a brief overview of the beat movement in the United States. In the 1940s and 50s, a new generation of poets rebelled against the conventions of mainstream American life and writing. They became known as the beat poets, a name that evokes weariness, the beat under a piece of music, and beatific spirituality. At first, they organized in the New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. By the 1950s, poets at the heart of the movement had settled in the Bay Area, especially in neighborhoods near beat poet and publisher Lawrence Ferlinghetti's bookstore, City Lights. Beat poets sought to write in an authentic, unfettered style. The first thought was the best thought. This is how the central beat poet Allen Ginsberg described their method of spontaneous writing. Beat poets expanded their consciousnesses through explorations of hallucinogenic drugs, sexual freedom, Eastern religion, and the natural world. They took inspiration from the surrealist, the metaphysical poets, visionary poets such as William Blake, jazz musicians, and haiku and Zen poetry. Beat poetry emerged from the disillusionment that followed World War II, a period of unimaginable atrocities including the Holocaust and the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. Following the end of the war, the United States and the Soviet Union quickly entered a Cold War, a period of geopolitical hostility that created paranoia and cultural and political repression at home. By the mid-1950s, the Beat helped spearhead a cultural vanguard, reacting against institutionalized American values like materialism and conformity. With this, we have come to an end of our modernist period. Throughout my lectures on modernist period, I have discussed modernist authors, modernist poets, and I've talked about the various philosophies that ran across modernism. We'll next be talking about postmodernism that starts emerging in early 1960s and becomes a dominant force in the 1970s. To know exactly what postmodernism is, how it's different from modernism, what are the features and who were the major writers of postmodernism, this lecture would be a good start.